2 Kings chapter 15 and verse 25 is where we're going to continue our study tonight. We're going to make a shift in the book of Kings, or rather the narrator of the book of Kings, the writer, makes our shift to the northern kingdom, and it's going to remain there for most of the rest of the book of First Kings. And so just by way of review, just a short review from where we've been, we had the split of the kingdom in First Kings chapter 12. And then we read about Jeroboam's idolatry that he sets up at the end of chapter 12. And then in 13, he's confronted by an unnamed prophet. And then in chapter 14, there's a prophecy pronounced against his house. And then in chapter 14, beginning in verse 21, it begins the process of, through chapter 15 and verse 24, it begins the process of looking at the other kings of Judah. But now where we are, beginning in chapter 15 and verse 25 through toward the very end of chapter 22, we're going to look at the kings of the north. The kings of the north. So that will be our focus. And in particular, once we get to 17 through the majority of 22, that's going to be a focus on Ahab because of a pivotal role he played in the ruin of Israel. Because you remember, we're studying this book under the idea of the rise and the ruin of Israel. Well, they've already risen to their zenith, and now they're on their path down from the top of that hill, top of that mountain, to their ruin. And it's just picking up steam as it keeps going. And so where we pick up in chapter 15 and verse 25, we begin with Nadab, who is the son of Jeroboam. And it backs up time a little bit chronologically speaking, but then moves forward. And these kings that are mentioned all reign during the time of King Asa, which was the king that we left off with in chapter 15 of the same book just last week. And so let's move forward by looking at these kings of Israel. And by Israel, you remember, we mean the 10 northern tribes. And by Judah, we mean the 2 southern tribes that stayed in the house of David. So chapter 15, verse 25. Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, began to reign over Israel in the second year of Asa, king of Judah. Okay, so again, there's Asa, and you're going to see his name mentioned over and over. And so the narrator is telling us when their reigns are interlocking, so to speak. That is, this king is reigning at this time in the south, and then here are all these kings in the north that are going to be reigning as well. So in the second year of the reign of Asa, king of Judah, he reigned over Israel 2 years. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father in his sin, which he made Israel to sin, which you remember is the tagline that is used 23 times by one person's count in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings to describe the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. He causes all Israel to sin. He introduced calf worship or idolatry from the very inception of his nation in the 10 northern tribes. And so it's something that constantly is reminded, and every person is judged. The 10 northern tribes, of course, Israel, all of the kings are evil, and they all walk in those same sins, and they all go after idols in particular. And we're going to see a new set of idolatry introduced toward the end of this chapter. And so they're judged that way. Whereas the house of Judah, the kings there are judged by whether or not they walk in the ways of David, their father. And of course, part of that has to do with the promise God made to David in 2 Samuel 7. But it also has to do with the fact that David never had any problems with idolatry, in the sense that he never welcomed any outside or foreign idols the way that Solomon did. And so they are judged by that standard. And so that's a short synopsis of his 2-year reign. But then we're going to see of his demise. Verse 27, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, of the house of Issachar, that is, of the tribe of Issachar, conspired against him, and Baasha struck him down at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, for Nadab and all Israel were laying siege to Gibbethon. Now, Gibbethon was on the edge of the western Judean hills, and most scholars believe that what they were trying to do here was kind of drive a wedge between Philistia and Judah and impact Judah economically. They were trying to create some problems for Judah, is what some people believe. Others believe that maybe they were simply trying to recover some land that had once belonged to the tribe of Dan. Either way, both scenarios are plausible, but it doesn't really change what the narrator of the Kings is trying to get us to see, and that is that Baasha is murdered or assassinated. Now, he's the first of several kings. There are going to be 6 kings that are assassinated or die in the process of, they die under suspicious circumstances, I should say, during the time of their reign, and we'll run into a number of them, obviously, in our study. And so it says in verse 28, so Baasha killed him in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. And as soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam none that breathed until he had destroyed it according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. You remember this came to Jeroboam in chapter 14, verses 10 and 11, as we see it, where it pronounced at the end of their house that there would not be a ruling dynasty. And so with this, we see the first dynasty change in the 10 northern tribes. 2 southern tribes, there will be no dynasty changes. Everyone will be a descendant of David. 10 northern tribes, several dynasty changes, and this is the first of many. And so he goes and he kills and wipes out the house of Jeroboam. Now, that's not an uncommon practice. The reason why many kings would do this, new dynasties would do this, is so that no one would get the idea from the previous family that they could create problems, that they could rise up and reclaim the throne, so to speak. And so many times they just wiped out the family. I'm not saying it's right in what they did. I'm saying it simply was their practice. But it was also used by Baasha on this occasion to solidify his reign, but God used it also in the fulfillment of the prophecy that he pronounced against Jeroboam and his family. And then in verse 30, there's an explanation given as to why this happened. It was for the sins of Jeroboam that he sinned, and that he made Israel to sin because of the anger because of the anger to which he provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, talking about his idolatry. All this is happening because of his idolatrous practice. Now, the rest of the acts of Nadab and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. And so the north and the south are constantly kind of locked in this cold war, going back and forth with one another. And that's not necessarily an uncommon thing in international relations, but it's something that's going to characterize the split of these two nations, or the split of this nation into two nations that remain for quite some time. So now we come to Baasha and we look at his reign. It says, in the 3rd year of Asa, king of Judah, Baasha, the son of Ahijah, began to reign over Israel at Tisra, and he reigned 24 years. Now, he's the son of Ahijah. Now, Ahijah would have been seemingly a common name, but it is somewhat ironic that Baasha is the son of Ahijah. That was his father's name, not the Ahijah who pronounced doom upon the house of Jeroboam. But it is somewhat ironic that the prophet who pronounced doom upon the house of Jeroboam, also that the father of the man who fulfilled that prophecy, his name was also Ahijah. So there is a sense of irony there. And so it says he reigns over all Israel at Tisra, which was their early capital and launching place, so to speak. And he reigns for quite some time, for 24 years. And of course, this is the beginning of a new dynasty. Now it says he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin, which he made Israel to sin. So he's going into idolatry as well. Now you notice that, and what we're going to see is this, the assessment of these kings. God is not assessing them upon their skill as international diplomats. He's not assessing them on their economic policies. He's not assessing them on any of the things by which we would commonly assess human leaders today in a worldly sense. He's only assessing them on the fact, because this is ultimately the only thing that matters, as to how they led that nation. Did they lead that nation toward God, or did they lead that nation away from God? And that's the way God will judge those individuals who step into those roles. So chapter 16 and verse 1, it's not necessarily the best chapter break here. It says, and the word of the Lord came to Jehu, the son of Hanani, against Baasha, saying, since I exalted you out of the dust and made you leader over my people Israel, and you have walked in the ways of Jeroboam and have made my people Israel to sin, provoking me to anger with their sins, behold, I will utterly sweep away Baasha and his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Anyone belonging to Baasha who dies in the city, the dogs shall eat, and anyone who dies in the field, the birds of the heavens shall eat. And so Baasha follows the same steps with Jeroboam in a new dynasty. Now, God handed the dynasty over to him, and he does the same thing Jeroboam did, so he's going to get the same punishment Jeroboam got. His dynasty is going to end. It's going to be short-lived, and a third dynasty is going to come upon the scene. Well, actually, there's going to be a whole lot of chaos, and then there's going to be a more stable third dynasty. that comes upon the scene. That is, it's more stable in one sense, but spiritually it becomes detrimental to the house of Israel. And so the one who dies in the city, the dogs will eat, and anyone who dies in the field, the birds of the heavens shall eat. The idea is, again, of not a proper burial, of shame and reproach being brought upon the family, not being buried in the burial plot of their fathers. We saw that some with the young prophet in 1 Kings chapter 13 and in other places. So this is the judgment pronounced upon him. It says, now the rest of the acts of Baasha and what he did and his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Baasha slept with his fathers and was buried at Tisra, and Elah his son reigned in his place. Moreover, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Jehu, the son of Hananiah, and Hananiah against Baasha and his house, both because of all the evil that he did in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger with the work of his hands in being like the house of Jeroboam, and also because he destroyed it. So two things primarily that are mentioned here. Number one was his idolatry, which we saw at the very beginning. But there's an interesting second thing that's added at the end, and it says also because he destroyed it, talking about the house of Jeroboam. And so it can be somewhat confusing at first glance. I believe it's quite simple to come to a conclusion here that makes sense, but at first glance it can seem confusing because God pronounced judgment upon Jeroboam. So how could Baasha be held responsible for his killing of Jeroboam's household? Well, what we have to understand is that sometimes God uses the wicked practices of others in carrying out his punishment. For an example, he would use the nation of Babylon, which was far more wicked than the nation of Judah, to punish them and to carry them into captivity. This was Habakkuk's whole issue with the pronouncement of God. That's what the whole book is about. How can God use a more sinful nation than Judah to punish Judah? And Habakkuk wrestles with that question with God, and they have discussion together, and he comes to accept what it is that God has decreed. And so just because that Baasha does this doesn't mean that God approves of the wiping out of an entire family. Okay, so may seem difficult on the front end, but it's not as difficult to understand when you think of it logically in the senses of how God operates and how he can use that. Another example would be his prediction of Judas. He knew his son was going to be betrayed and handed over to the hands of wicked and lawless men, Acts chapter 2. But that didn't alleviate Judas. He simply used Judas's evil and his greed, and that played into his sovereign plan. And so it's not a thing of God making them do it. It's a way of God using man's free will, knowing what they're going to do, and interweaving that into his plan. And so that's why he comes against Baasha on this account. Then we meet Elah. In the 26th year of Asa, king of Judah, Elah, the son of Baasha, began to reign over all Israel in Tisra, and he reigned 2 years. But his servant Zimri, commander of half of his chariots, conspired against him. Okay, so commander of half of his chariots, Zimri, half of them were stationed in Tisra, or what probably later half were going to be stationed in Samaria, but Samaria hasn't been built yet. We're going to get to that in a little bit. And so he's got half of his chariots in a southern portion of Israel and half in a northern portion. And it seems as if the other half were stationed in Megiddo, which was a common battleground. And it's from that battleground that we get the image in the book of Revelation of the Battle of Armageddon. Now, notice I said image because it's not literal. Okay. Now, it says, when he was at Tisra, speaking of Elah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, who was over the household of Tisra. So one of his lead officials, they're together, and he's getting drunk. Now, this is a new thing with the kings. Now, certainly, I'm sure other kings had problems with alcohol, but this is the first one we're told that is getting drunk. He actively has an issue with it. So it's a new twist in the debauchery and the depravity of the kings. It says, verse 10, Zimri came in and struck him down and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his place. When he began to reign, as soon as he seated himself on the throne, he struck down all the house of Baasha. He did not leave a single male of his relatives or of his friends. Thus Zimri destroyed all the house of Baasha, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke against Baasha by Jehu the prophet. For all the sins of Baasha and the sins of Elah his son, which they sinned, and which they made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord God of Israel to anger with their idols. Now the rest of the acts of Elah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And so again, you get that summary statement. So now the dynasty has shifted again, but I don't really know that the second dynasty has ended now. The first dynasty was Jeroboam's. The second was Baasha's dynasty. And I don't really know that you can call this a third dynasty, because Zimri is not going to reign very long. Let's look at it. Verse 15, in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned 7 days in Tisra. So he lasts an entire week. So I don't really know that you can call this a new dynasty. I mean, I think you have to make it more than a year to be a dynasty. He makes it a week. Okay. It says, now the troops were encamped against Gibbethon. Now you remember in chapter 15 and verse 27, we've already run into that place in a conspiracy against that place. This is where Baasha kills Nadab. Now what's interesting is, in the process of 20 to 25 years, they're still trying to capture the same city and they can't do it. But here they are again. And it says now the troops were encamped against Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines. And the troops were encamped, heard it said, Zimri has conspired and killed the king. Therefore, all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp. And so Zimri thinks because he's killed the king, he's the new man in charge. He's the new king. But when the army gets word of it, now it's Omri. They want Omri, the leader of the army, to be their king. It says, so Omri went up from Gibbethon, he leaves the battle, and all Israel with him, and they besieged Tisra, some 40 miles away from Gibbethon. And so he's going basically to claim his throne. And it says, verse 18, when Zimri saw that the city was taken, he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house over him with fire, and he died. So he kills himself rather than be captured. And it says, because of the sins that he committed, doing evil in the sight of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam for his sin, which he committed, making Israel to sin. Now the rest of the acts of Zimri and the conspiracy that he made, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And so Zimri makes it an entire week, and he is overthrown. Tisra is captured. He burns down the city. And of course, that's going to help us understand some things that Omri is going to do in just a minute, because it seems as if a lot of destruction and a lot of turmoil has been characterized by Tisra, and Omri is going to change things up a little bit. But you see that he committed sins, doing evil on the side of the Lord, walking in the way of Jeroboam, the sin which he committed, making Israel to sin. Now, what's interesting, and a lot of commentators have wrestled with this, why is it that God makes that pronunciation when he only reigns 7 days? Well, the answer is obviously he's involved somewhat in the administration of the previous king, the king that he has killed, Elah. And so he's complicit in that as well. But also it's just the nature of his life. I mean, and the 7 days that he was there, he still promoted idolatry. He didn't make any plans to do. He didn't overthrow the king with plans of making a reformation or a restoration in Israel. And so it's something that still characterizes his life. All right. So now we come to Omri. Now this is really the beginning of the third dynasty. And this is going to be a dynasty that lasts almost 50 years in the process. And if you look at this family dynasty, the dynasty of Omri, from a purely political, worldly standpoint, we would consider them to be extremely, extremely successful. What's interesting is the Bible says they were nothing but abject failures. And some people wrestle with that, and they say the Bible obviously must be misunderstood, because they had international respect. Israel was respected on the international stage under the reigns of Omri and Ahab, and they accomplished great things. I mean, listen to some of this. Omri conquers Moab. He creates peace with Judah. He creates an alliance with Sidon, who had taken over, Tyre and Sidon, Hiram, king of Tyre, which had a relationship with David and Solomon. And so he has a marriage alliance, which we're going to see when we get to Ahab. Assyria, even 100 years after the life of Omri refers to Israel, the 10 northern tribes, as the house of Omri. And so he accomplishes quite a bit in not a long time. But yet God looks at his reign and says, he's actually been the most wicked king of all up to this point. And his son is going to be even more wicked than him. It's not that God is oblivious to those things. It's just at the end of the day, those things don't matter. It doesn't matter if you make your nation prosper economically or militarily. What matters is if they prosper spiritually, especially in a nation where God is the supreme sovereign, which he is with all nations, but in the special relationship that he had with Israel, the covenant that they had entered into at Sinai. And so we see the beginning of Omri's reign, and it kind of overlaps. There's a little bit of turmoil and not a lot of solidarity in his reign at the beginning. There's a kind of a co-regency, if you want to call it that, even though they weren't. Sometimes when you hear co-regency, you get the idea that they cooperated with one another. They were on the same team. That's not the way this went down. So verse 21, then the people of Israel were divided in two parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. But the people who followed Omri overcame the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died and Omri became king. We're not told exactly how he dies. He dies. Jewish tradition says that he dies militarily. He dies a violent death. It's not something that he just dies a good old age. And Omri ends up becoming king in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah. Excuse me. Now, when you back up to verse 15, it says in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, Zimri reigned, and then, of course, he reigned 7 days, and then Omri takes over. So that's the 27th year. This is the 31st year. And so there was 4 years in this process where where Omri was trying to solidify his reign. There was a division amongst the people before it takes off. And so it says, again in verse 23, in the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri began to reign over Israel, and he reigned for 12 years. 6 years he reigned in Tisra. So 12 years, 6 of them spent in Tisra, and 4 of those 6 years were trying to solidify his throne. And it says that he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver, and he fortified the hill and called the name of the city that he built Samaria after the name of Shemer, the owner of the hill. And so he moves the capital. This becomes the capital, and it remains the capital through the end of the Northern Empire. Okay, through the end of the Northern Kingdom. It's 300 feet in elevation, 300 feet that is above the plains surrounding it. So it's an elevated plateau, very similar to the way that Jerusalem is. It's roughly 160 acres when he bought it originally. No doubt he probably expanded it a little bit more. He paid roughly 2 talents of silver. That's 150 pounds. So roughly $15 to $20 million. He paid in modern currency for this plot of land that's going to become the new capital. And it overlooks major commercial routes in the Esdraelon Valley or Plains. And so it's an important location in many ways. And so he chooses to move it there, and that's where it will actually remain. Now, verse 25. Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord and did more evil than all who were before him. Now, again, great accomplishments. He actually, when you look, he brought solidarity, he brought peace, he brought stability. But God looks at him and says, spiritually speaking, he was worse than all the others before him. For he walked in all the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, in the sense that he made Israel to sin, provoking the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger by their idols. He's continuing to plunge them into idolatry. Now, the rest of the acts of Omri that he did and the might that he showed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Omri slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria, and Ahab his son reigned in his place. Now, the Bible does give somewhat mention to the rest of the mighty acts and the might that he showed. So it does give lip service. It mentions it in passing, but it doesn't make it central because, again, in the eyes of God, that's not what is central. So now his son Ahab takes over, and Ahab will be center stage through the rest of 1 Kings. Now, Ahab is the 7th king of the Northern Empire or kingdom. And what's interesting is when you look at these kings that are placed in position 7, they tend to be quite extraordinarily wicked. And Ahab is that. Now, the reason why, okay, let me back up for a minute. So growing up, and even when I was in school the first time studying, people would say that the Bible was incredibly brief. And I didn't really know, I kind of got it, but I didn't really grasp it. But now, as I'm studying even the Kings here, I've started to see it over the last couple of years, but especially in the Kings now, I'm starting to see what it means. It is speeding through a lot of these people and a lot of their accomplishments, and it slows down when it focuses on pivotal individuals who had something to do with the rise or the ruin of Israel. A lot of time on Solomon, because he brought it to, he allowed it to rise. God built the kingdom under Solomon. A lot of time spent on Jeroboam, because he started this trend downward. And a lot of time is going to be spent on Ahab, because he's going to be the first king that really accelerates this thing going downhill. The others did bad. Jeroboam did terrible, of course, was terrible by introducing idolatry. But Ahab is going to introduce a different type of idolatry. And he's going to introduce Baal worship. Now, technically, the proper pronunciation for this god's name, little g, is Baal. Baal, but I'm going to call him Baal because that's the name that, or the pronunciation that most people are familiar with. But the proper pronunciation is Baal. And so he sets number 7. Now, it's interesting when you look at Genesis 4 and 5, you see 2 lengthy genealogies of the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. And if you look in the descendants of Cain, in position 7 is Lamech, an extremely wicked man. And in position 7 in the genealogy of Seth is Enoch, a man who was so righteous that God took him home. He did not die. And so what the writer of Genesis is doing in Genesis 4 and 5 is contrasting Cain and his descendants with Seth and his descendants, righteousness versus wickedness. And 2 individuals that really characterize that are set in respectively in position 7. Position 7 of Lamech in Cain's family, and then of Enoch in Judah's family. So with that being said, we're going to be given a short introduction to Ahab, and then we're going to turn next week into this lengthy discussion about him. So verse 29, chapter 16. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, Ahab the son of Omri began to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord more than all who were before him. And if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that is, what has been the tipping point that God condemned all the other kings in the north for, the previous 6 for, was their commitment to the calf worship set up by Jeroboam. If that had been a light thing, now he's going one step further. It says, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, the king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him. Now notice here, so he marries outside of the land again. He's committing a Solomon mistake. Now, this is, by the way, what we mentioned earlier when we said that Ahab created peace with Sidon by marriage with his son. This is it. Now, Ethbaal and Jezebel, you can hear the name of their god in their names, right? Baal or Baal. And so you have Jezebel, who is, well, just yikes. I mean, that's all you can say about her. She is an extremely, extremely wicked woman, and stirs up her husband toward wickedness. Very anti the God of Israel. Chapter 8 and verse 4, chapter 18 and verse 4, chapter 18 and verse 13. She kills a great deal of the prophets that are in Israel. If Obadiah had not stepped up and hidden some of the prophets, all of them would have been killed. And of course, she makes it her mission in life, we'll see, to kill Elijah. And so it seems that she may have been, quote, a high priestess of the god Baal. So then you have Ethbaal. He overthrew Hiram. You remember the Hiram that had a relationship with David and Solomon, and he conquered Tyre and united Tyre and Sidon. So Ahab and Jezebel, they go and they serve Baal. This is a whole new thing. Now, Baal is a fertility god. And fertility is not just what we might think of as human procreation fertility, but also the fertility of the ground. This is an agricultural society, and so they depend upon that. And so fertility is more holistic in its nature. Now, don't get me wrong, it was sexually perverted, but it didn't just apply to, we're having trouble getting pregnant. It believed that there was this connection between human fertility and sexuality, and what that indicated, that was a way of worshiping Baal, that he might create fertility in the ground and things along those lines. So this is what Ahab does in verse 32. He erected an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. So he builds Baal a temple. It's complete opposite of Solomon, who builds a temple for God. He builds a temple for Baal. And that temple is going to stand for quite some time. We're going to run into it several times throughout the process of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so it says, verse 33, and Ahab made an Asherah, the female counterpart of Baal. We've talked about the Asherah and the Asherah poles, so we won't go back into that. It says, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings who were before him. Again, that's repeated for the second time, because it's not just about calf worship. Now it's about Baal worship. It's about worshiping the same gods of the Canaanites that God had dispelled for their idolatrous practices and all of the overflow of their wickedness. Okay. But then the chapter closes in a quite peculiar way. You're not really expecting this. It shifts to a discussion of Jericho. Now let's read it, and then we'll try and talk about it a little bit and see if we can put it into some perspective. So it says, in his days, Hiel of Bethel built Jericho. He laid its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and set its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. Now when you remember, Jericho was the first city they conquered in the promised land. It was a pivotal city, but it was kind of the first fruits of the promised land. God said, you can't take anything from it. You burn it as an offering to me. And of course, Achan's going to take some things that's going to create some problems, but that's dealt with in chapter 7. And then chapter 8, things pick up and are great. But in chapter 6 and verse 26, Joshua says that the person who tries to rebuild the city, he will pay the price. When he lays the first stone in the rebuilding of the walls of the city, he'll lose his firstborn son. And when he hangs the gates, that is, he completes the city, he will lose his youngest son. And of course, that's what happens here in this process. But why is this attached here? It's somewhat peculiar. Okay, first of all, it may be that we're meant to understand this as something that Ahab encourages. It's certainly indicative of Ahab. Ahab doesn't really have time for God. He's too busy in calf worship and Baal worship. He certainly is not a friend of the God of Israel. And so to do something like this makes sense. It's something that helps us to see the nature of his reign, that is so completely anti-God that it's reversing the conquest of the land. God cast out the people of Canaan because of their sins with Baal and all of the idolatry and the wickedness that associated with those idolatries. And now here he is rebuilding the first fruits of the city. It's as if he's trying to go back to the very beginning and reverse all of the conquest and embrace all of the sinfulness of the nations who were before him. Some people believe that Hiel was the commander of the army of Ahab. Jewish tradition says that. But I want you to also notice that Hiel is of Bethel. Now, Bethel is the place, you remember, there where they set up calf worship, Dan in the northernmost section and Bethel in the southernmost section. Bethel actually becomes the more predominant of the two when you look at the prophets and things along those lines. So it's not a good picture. Now, that's a summary. We're going to get the details in the upcoming chapters. And we're going to be introduced in this section. It'll begin a new section for us in Kings of the kings versus the prophets. God is going to, and of course, we've seen little bits of the prophets. We see them pronouncing judgments in certain places along the way. Ahijah and Jehu have done so. but we're going to see them take really center stage, especially in the prophets Elijah and his successor Elisha. They're going to take center stage for the rest of First Kings. Elijah will be, and then Elisha primarily in Second Kings, the first part, the opening chapters of it anyway. So this is getting into, selfishly, this is getting into my favorite portion of First Kings. When you study Elijah, you study, he becomes so central, not just to the story of Israel, but to the story of redemption. You remember the Elijah who is to come is John the Baptist, and John the Baptist has the same garments and diet and attitude and prophetic ministry that Elijah had. Further, when Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, two people appear with him. One is Moses and the other is Elijah. And so his ministry is so very important. It's so very interesting. A lot of things here. And I'm excited about jumping into this next section, even though it means that there is the ruin of Israel is inevitable and it's coming faster and faster. It does help us to understand how to live more faithfully for God. It helps us to understand what our job is, to speak up for the things of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. And so I'm excited about the things coming forward and hope that you'll continue to be with us as we study First and Second Kings together.